Thanks so much, Patricia. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alberta Transplant Institute seminar for April 5th. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada. We are always pleased to acknowledge that their vibrant presence continues to enrich our community in many ways. And if others would like to contribute, if they're on different territories, please feel free to share that with us in the chat. We'd like to begin by thanking Paladin for their support for the ATR seminar series. So we'd like to start today's seminar by acknowledging the week that we're in, which is the week of Green Shirt Day. On April 7th, 2018, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a young defenseman for the Humboldt Broncos hockey team named Logan Boulet succumbed to injuries that had been sustained in a fatal bus accident. His parents, Bernadine and Toby Boulet, agreed to donate his organs so that others could live. They did this because Logan had himself taken the small but crucial step of talking to him about his wishes. And we think of this as, you know, a small thing that can be done over the dinner table, but in fact, it's of crucial importance and has really major implications and can have incredible impact, as we've seen in this sad case. He had been inspired by his former coach and mentor, Rick Sujit, who had passed away, unfortunately, prematurely in June of 2017, and as well became an organ donor. April 7th is officially the day to commemorate the life of Logan Boulet and Green Shirt Day, and the tremendous impact that he and his family have had on the organ donation landscape in Canada. But today we're using the day today as a way for our ATI to remember and commemorate the lives of Logan and all organ donors and their families who have given a gift of life and left a legacy that lives on today through the lives of our transplant patients. We have two wonderful guest speakers today who have quite different stories to tell about their experiences in considering the concept of organ donation. And I'll tell you about both of them first, and then we'll move on to their contributions. The first speaker is Dr. Becky Valentine. She was born and raised in Calgary. She pursued her lifelong passion of veterinary medicine, starting her career in emergency veterinary medicine in 2001, and over time pursuing specialization in veterinary dermatology in 2015. Becky is the proud mom of 17-year-old twins and a French bulldog. She's in 2010, while in Ontario, Becky lost her husband very sadly to an idiopathic deep brain bleed. And in a complex story that she'll tell us about, sadly missed the opportunity to participate in donation. She's recently become interested in advocacy for donation with a focus on educating families at the right time with the right information to help avoid other missed opportunities. I will also tell you about our second speaker, and then we'll move on with Becky. Jenn Woolfsmith will be our second speaker. She's a full-time CPA and project management professional with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. She lives also in Calgary with her husband, Dan, and her sons, Owen and Declan. Jenn is also mom to Mackenzy, who became an organ donor just shy of her second birthday in 2012. She believes that organ donation can offer a potential source of hope to the bereaved, and she has lived it herself. And it did so for her. And she wants to see every family have the opportunity to choose organ donation and participate in a smooth process if it's the right thing for them and for their loved ones. And so the overall title today is Stories from the Front Lines, Two Families' Donation Journeys. And so, Becky, I'll hand it over to you to begin. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and I will try to share my screen. There we go. Everybody can see that, hopefully.
That looks perfect.
Okay. So I'm not sure. Okay, I'm a little bit anxious. I haven't shared this story with a bunch of strangers before, but I wrote it down so that it would be smoother for me to tell you. It's hard to know where to start with my story because I have found through the years that the storytelling is so therapeutic. I can go on forever. This is the first time I've tried writing it down, saving you all from my frequent oblique tangents about what an amazing human my husband was. Roberto Poma was my Italian prince. We met in our veterinary residency training at the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. Roberto was a veterinary neurologist, just having defended his DVSC thesis, and I was an intern in small animal medicine and surgery. Roberto was charming and romantic, funny and so smart, and he soon showed me what unconditional love meant. We met when I turned 30, he was 32. We married 2 years later. Roberto wanted desperately to have kids and couldn't wait to have them. I wasn't so sure on many levels, but I knew whatever he and I did together would be magical. 2 years later, we had the most amazing set of twins, 1 boy and 1 girl. Valentina Anna Poma came out as a mini me, and Leonardo Piero Poma came out as a replica of his dad. Roberto was a natural father. He was so proud to be a dad. He loved our piccoli capolavori, or little masterpieces, to his core. His face would light up every time he saw them, his smile a mile wide. I can hear his voice when he would come in from work calling out, "Buonasera," and the kids would drop whatever they were doing and run to the door, arms open wide. Roberto loved life. He was grateful for his life. He was compassionate and kind. He went to church on Sundays. He loved his parents more than anything, and he found joy in every day. He made everyone he met feel important through his authenticity, curiosity, and genuine connection. On November 12th, 2010, I popped into his office before heading home for lunch. Roberto was on clinics and had patients in the hospital, students on rotation, and a dog in the MRI. When I got to his office, he said he was dizzy, felt like he was falling to the left. Immediately, I made him raise his arms and smile and talk, and it was then I assumed he was having a stroke. He told me he was having an acute vestibular event. I summoned the help of a colleague. We walked him to our car. It wasn't far. He was walking and talking. I figured it made sense to drive him to the hospital 6 minutes away. But by the time we arrived, Roberto had stopped speaking and was having seizure activity. I remember very little of that hospital. I know I made arrangements for a friend to pick up the kids. I'd be home after dinner after we got some answers. I didn't know why there was a social worker there. I wasn't hysterical. I could keep it together. I understood the medicine. Roberto was healthy. He was just having a stroke. They wanted to send him to the hospital in Kitchener. There they had a stroke clinic. They could fix him. He was taken in an ambulance and I rode with a friend. When we got to Kitchener, another friend told me I needed to call his parents. They were in Italy. They needed to know. But surely they were going to fix him. He was the healthiest person I knew. The CT scan showed a bleed. His right ventricle was full. He had a midline shift. He had localized his own lesion. He told me he was falling to the left. I thought he'd be proud. They would airlift him to a neurosurgical unit, and there they would fix him. Hamilton would fix him. McMaster University Neurological ICU. The kids were still with friends. They're fine. Angiograms were done. MRI 1, MRI 2. Where's the bleed? How can we get to it? When they came to tell me they needed to intubate him, my knees gave out. I knew how hard it is to get someone off of ventilation, and I knew what the survival stats do when a person is intubated. In veterinary medicine, we have less precise measurements of brain death. Dogs don't know how to do math. They don't know how to recall childhood memories. They know love, play, sleeping, and eating. That's all we ask of them. Maybe this is why our parameters to measure brain death are so crude compared to human medicine. In dogs, if you put an alcohol-soaked cotton swab on the cornea and there's no response, we call that brain death. In a dog, you would make the call right then. No more CPR, no more heroics. The resident came to examine Roberto, and after seeing his pupils, he quickly reached for a cotton ball and soaked it in alcohol. He then put it on Roberto's cornea, and nothing happened. I waited for the doctors to gather in the room to tell me what I already knew. Roberto was herniating his brain. There was no more fixing. There was no fancy trocar to relieve the pressure. There was no catchy tune coming through the TV with a hero coming to save the day in the end. This was it. I could choose a craniotomy and keep him alive, or I could take the life support away. But either way, he would not be able to speak to his kids and he would not come off of a ventilator. He would not have a life. Roberto and I had decided when we made our will that we should make medical directive decisions as if we were dogs. Sounds funny to humans. He said that. If you must make a decision, pretend I'm a dog so that I will always be able to love, play, eat, and sleep. That's all I need to do. But that option was off the table. As soon as I declined the craniotomy and we knew what the outcome would be, I asked the doctor two things. How can we hasten this process? And who do I speak to about organ donation? I knew Roberto was a jackpot, so to speak. He had all his organs and he was super healthy. He could save so many people. Roberto had signed his donor card. So had I. We both believed in the greater good, in our community and in our fellow humans. We both would want to help people. There's no doubt about that. And I knew the medicine. I knew he had an idiopathic deep brain bleed. I knew it was random luck, and I knew there was no going back. I knew he would die with a very healthy body. I don't remember too much about the person who came to speak to me about organ donation. I remember her as quiet and soft-spoken. She said they would wait for him to get to a certain level of brain death. Apparently, there were more levels in human medicine beyond the alcohol and the cornea dog test. That would take time. And then when he was in that level, at that plateau, he would go into the OR without me. Okay, I said, I just want to hold him in my arms when he dies. That's it. So simple. When his heart stops, he's the love of my life. All I heard was, no, you can't be with him. His heart can't stop and still save another person. It had never dawned on me, despite my medical training, that donation had to be from organs that were perfused until the very end. On TV, they're in coolers on ice. Can't I just hold him until he dies and then you take him? Or can I come into the OR? But those were not options. If I wanted to hold him when he died, then they couldn't use his organs. But they said you can donate his long bones. I don't remember the language precisely, but I do remember that no one referred to Roberto as the donor. And I think that would have helped, like telling me he was becoming a donor, reminding me that that's what he wanted. Instead, it was more about what I would give them. Wait, I thought, wait, what about the kids? It was one thing for me to lose my one true love, but what about our kids losing their dad? This most amazing of dads, this most amazing of people. I contacted a child trauma therapist and we talked about how to help the kids process this. Do I bring them into the ICU? They were 5 years old. Their dad was hooked up to machines. He was not going to be able to say goodbye. We decided it would be better to let them touch him without the machines, resting peacefully, not in this sterile, smelly, scary place with tubes and machines everywhere. Let them touch him after. But then I thought, well, if they took his long bones, what are they going to be able to touch? What would they feel? Well, this woman said, we could harvest his corneas. Okay, I said, that's something. Holding Roberto for his last breath was a moment I treasure, a moment that has meant the world to me since. I had 48 hours between walking in and seeing him eating ravioli, telling me he was dizzy, to having to choose against a craniotomy. Being able to hold him was a way I was able to say goodbye. But if I knew then what I know now, I would have done it differently. I wish someone could have been there to hold my hand, to remind me that Roberto wanted to be a donor, and that one day when the darkness came, there would be a glimmer of light, knowing that he had saved so many people, that he could have saved so many families the pain and grief of suffering and loss. I wish someone could have told me that families of donors report feeling solace that their loved one became a donor, that my kids would know he was a hero in death as he was in life, that he saved someone else's papa or brother or child. So I'm here today to use my story to find a way to prevent someone else from becoming a missed opportunity, to find a way to help people navigate the worst day of their lives in a way that preserves hope and love and preserves life. Most people I know have signed their donor card, and yet I'm not alone as a family member who said no in that moment of crisis. How do we support families in this moment? And how do we educate people about an event they think will never happen to them? Thank you all for giving me my opportunity to tell my story. to tell you about Roberto Poma, and to give me the chance to change just one family's choice.
Becky, thank you so much for sharing those experiences, which are obviously deeply painful, and yet said with a hopeful outreach. Thank you so much. Let's hear from Jenn, who has an equally tragic but slightly different experience with organ donation. Jenn, go ahead.
Thanks, Lori, and thank you, Becky. I have to say I've never had to follow another personal story. I've had others tell me it's difficult to speak after hearing Mackenzie's story, and I can say with absolute certainty that's true. I thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing husband with us today. I'm here to share my amazing daughter with you, and I will attempt to pull up the slides now. You can see her beautiful face. Can everybody see her?
Yeah, looks great, Jenn.
Perfect. So this is Mackenzie Jane Woolfsmith, my daughter. On May 2nd, 2012, we received the call that is every parent's worst nightmare. Our beautiful girl, Mackenzie, had been injured at her day home, and she was en route to the Children's Hospital here in Calgary. My husband and I were both at work that day when the phone call came in, and we both immediately rushed to the hospital, not really knowing what could have possibly happened that resulted in our sweet girl being in an ambulance. To give some context, just to how devastating and confusing that day was, let me back up a little bit and tell you about Mackenzie. On that day, she was 22 months old. The picture in her pink pajamas here is one of the last pictures that I have of her. You can see her sparkly eyes and her smile. She was the stars and the moon to us. She was actually born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we lived at the time for my work. And although she was born down south, we knew we'd be headed back north shortly after her birth. We moved back to Calgary when she was only 3 months old, which unfortunately meant I had to go straight back to work, given my maternity leave was down in the States and I had the measly 12 weeks. But Dan, my husband, became a stay-at-home dad for 6 months. We knew 3 months was way too young to contemplate any kind of care, especially in Canada, where it wasn't necessarily set up for infants as it was in the States. So he stayed home. We chose that he stayed home for 6 months while we got settled and we sorted out childcare, because he eventually had to get back to his engineering career as well. Finding childcare was really difficult and stressful, given her young age, like I said, and the wait lists at the time in Calgary. If you weren't on a wait list for the full 12 months of a typical maternity leave, then you really didn't have a hope in getting a space in a licensed facility. So when we realized we weren't going to get one, there was no miracle to find ourselves a licensed daycare spot, we shifted our focus to day homes. We interviewed a total of 7 different day homes after narrowing that list down from many more, and finally landed on one that we thought would be the best fit for our family, but most importantly for Mackenzie. We had been able to witness her little personality start to shine through in those early months. And we knew she was a little reserved when she was in a new situation, often spending time sitting on mine or Dan's lap, just watching her surroundings, making sure she knew what was going on, sort of assessing the lay of the land. But when she figured out it was safe, she'd jump right into the middle of whatever was going on. Dan's parties were her favorite, and she had a way of drawing everyone into them. Mackenzie had been at her day home for a little over a year when May 2nd rolled around. We had been through quite a lot with her daycare provider by that time, and we knew that Mackenzie loved her. Each morning, we would watch her run up to the front door to greet her with a big smile. And each evening, we would watch as she blew one more kiss to her before finally getting in the car. When her daycare provider called me on May 2nd to tell me I had to get to the hospital, I could never have imagined what the next 3 days would look like. I arrived at the hospital before Mackenzy did and was greeted by the social worker who brought me to a small adjoining room to the trauma area, where what felt like a massive team of people were prepping for her arrival. Shortly after she was brought in by the paramedics, a flurry of activity increased. The social worker was propping the door open to the trauma room, trying to listen to what was going on and translate everything for us. Then a police officer came into the room and told us that she had come in with a heartbeat. I remember looking at him like he was the most ridiculous person on the face of the earth, because of course she came in with a heartbeat. It was like telling me the sky was blue. What I didn't know was that her heart had actually stopped after her injury, and the paramedics had revived her on the way to the hospital. I was quickly becoming overwhelmed by all of these things happening and all of this information coming at me, and none of it made any sense. And I knew my cognitive abilities to really grasp what was happening was diminishing by the minute. And I remember the social worker telling our friends and family when they started arriving at the hospital, Dan understands what's going on, Jenn doesn't. The next 10 hours or so were filled with tests. CAT scan and MRI, waiting for results, police interviews, and meeting with a child abuse specialist. To look at Mackenzy, she had no outward sign of trauma. She looked like she was sleeping peacefully, and so it made it harder to comprehend why everyone was so frantic around her. What we came to learn was the story that her daycare provider had given to the police was not consistent with the severity of her injuries. And so extra care was being taken to make sure they were interpreting the results correctly. Sometime just before midnight on that first day, Dr. Megan Mahoney had the job of sitting Dan and I down and letting us know that everything was pointing to her injuries being catastrophic. She had a spinal injury, and the best case outcome would be that she would survive, but be paralyzed from the neck down, never again breathing or eating on her own. But even that was unlikely. Up to this point, we had mostly been trying to stay out of everyone's way so they could figure out what was going on in her little body and fix it. I always assumed they would figure out what was going on and fix it. But after the reality of our situation started to sink in, I immediately went to Mackenzy and I took her hand and I made sure to stroke her cheek and hair so that she could feel my touch in case she was paralyzed. My husband moved to the bed as well and held her other hand across from me. I was staring down at Mackenzy, trying to process everything, when Dan said the words that have come to mean so much to us. Can we donate her organs? I immediately looked up at him and said, yes, she's going to be an organ donor. I still don't know why we both came to the acceptance of her prognosis so quickly. I would have thought that I would be begging someone, anyone, to find a way to fix her. But I couldn't bear the thought of Mackenzy hearing that. What if she heard me begging or screaming or crying and thought I was somehow angry with her that she had to go? What if she thought she was letting us down by not being able to stay? And I couldn't put that much pressure on her. So instead, I bent down, spoke right into her ear. I told her how much I loved her and how grateful I was for her and how proud I was of her and how our lives had been forever changed on that day when she became ours. Then I told her that she was in charge, that I wanted her to do whatever the right thing was for her, that she didn't have to worry about mommy or daddy. I told her I trusted her and I would follow her lead. And everything after that was Mackenzy's doing, supported, of course, by her amazing medical team. The next day, we prepared for the official test that would confirm the dreaded time of death, paperwork, tests, and finally her donor coordinator setting up shop outside the room to start the work of placing her organs. Her body had been through so much by this time, and she was very unstable. Her medical team prepared us that if her heart should stop, and it could at any moment, she would no longer qualify to be an organ donor. But it never did. Mackenzy was fighting. She gave us the final proof of her resolve when on the second night they reperformed the echo. Originally, it was thought that her heart had been through too much and was too weak for transplant, but on that second day, it had somehow strengthened. Her donor coordinator came into the room sometime in the middle of the night to tell us the good news and let us know that they now had 3 hospitals interested in her heart. And we high-fived. Just think about that for a moment. Sitting in the palliative care room of the PICU is probably the last place on earth you would expect to see anybody high-fiving. But we did. Organ donation was giving us all something to rally around. It was giving us all a meaningful job to do, which was to support Mackenzy so that she could save lives. And my husband and I, our friends and family, and the whole medical team, we were all in that together. We listened anxiously as the donor coordinator undertook the negotiations with each of the teams on timing. The heart team couldn't get to her until a certain time, but the liver recipient wasn't going to make it much longer. All against the backdrop of Mackenzy herself continuing to be unstable. We found ourselves in this paradoxical place of wanting it to all come together quickly so that she could be successful in her donation and so her little body could finally be at rest, but not wanting to ever let her go. Dan and I got to spend the last hour with her, just the 3 of us, as the nurses and social workers stood guard outside her room, coming in only to check the monitors and adjust her medications as needed. We laid with her in the bed and took turns using the stethoscope to listen to her heart while singing to her and trying to pack a lifetime of sentiments into the short time we had left. But we were also watching the clock and willing the teams to make it on time. When we finally were given the nod that all was ready for her, we stood in her room and watched as a loving team wheeled her down the hall with her favorite blanket wrapped around her, her stuffy tucked under her arm, and the knowledge that she was going to answer the prayers of 4 other families. She's our hero. In the months and years since Mackenzy's death, we've had to deal with quite a few unique situations. Her daycare provider was eventually charged with 2nd-degree murder after a 14-month police investigation. Over the course of the next 3 years, we had trial dates and victim impact statements. She eventually pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. We also welcomed her 2 little brothers, Owen and Declan, who are now 10 and 6. Owen was born on March 2nd, 2013, 10 months to the day after we got that call. It has been and continues to be a roller coaster of emotions, but through it all, we've had the comfort and the meaning for Mackenzy's donation. I often think about all of the things that had to go exactly right for it to happen. The medical examiner had to be convinced to allow it to happen, given the suspicious nature of her death. He originally said no. And it took social workers and advocacy for him to even consider it. Eventually, they agreed that if we didn't donate her corneas, everything else could be donated. And they had to put a lot of extra procedures in place. They needed to have people in the OR with them, chain of custody, all of that, as her body was considered evidence. There was the mountains of paperwork, all of the tests, all of the matching, all of the logistics, and everyone, especially Mackenzy's resolve to make it happen and not get distracted by any of the noise or the obstacles in front of us. It was a very overwhelming and emotional process. And I know in my heart there was a million different times when it could have all gone off the rails, or we just could have simply become overwhelmed and said no. Sometimes I don't know why. I don't understand why we got to be so lucky that she was able to donate successfully. But I know I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful for people like Becky sharing her story as well, so we can make sure that anyone else who might find comfort in it gets that opportunity as well. So thank you for letting me share my daughter and my story.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jenn, for that story as well. I've talked to you many times and heard these events a number of times, and they never fail to have profound impact. Both of these stories speak to not only the sorrow and unbelievable tragedy of deaths that occur now, but the potential for real hope that can come with the thought that some good can come of this situation. How do you think, so sadly, in addition to the tragedies themselves, we've had two different outcomes here of engagement with the possibility of organ donation. It's helpful when I listen to you, Jenn, to hear again your conviction that this has had a positive impact long term in what was, as you both said, the worst possible day of your life. Becky, what kinds of things do you think could have made a difference to your experience with the organ donation system? There are obviously many. I'm not sure where to start, but perhaps you have some thoughts on that.
What immediately comes to mind is just having a little bit of education of knowing the experience of families and the positive impact that it has. I didn't ever know anything other than signing my card. So I believe there's a large body of evidence that shows that it provides people solace. And I think that would have helped to know that. I also love the way, since becoming involved with all of you, the way that you speak about the donors and that they're becoming a donor. Like I mentioned in my talk, it was very, it wasn't about Roberto. And I think that if it had been a little bit about Roberto, it would have been helpful. So I always imagined what I wanted to do. It took me 10 years to find you or have the strength to do what I'm doing now. I always thought, well, just make me that person. I'll go into the hospital and I'll hold someone's hand and I'll tell them that it is going to be good. The other thing that I think that would have helped, and I like Jenn, you're amazing, Jenn. But the hallway of heroes, having some recognition, if I had to leave him before he died, some recognition, of that hallway, that he's not just going into a OR, but that he's going with people and with a team and with the intention of saving people's lives. When Jenn talks about that moment, you don't know that you aren't rational, or you don't know that you can't. I thought he would live the whole time. So it's an irrational time. It's very hard to be logical. So I'm here to figure out a way to, I don't know. I think education, I think the gentle hand of someone showing me that this would have been light.
So, so the message of solace that you described, Becky, that you've learned kind of since then, and that Jenn speaks to with such clarity, how did, and Jenn, feel free to weigh in here, both of you. How do you think, so maybe that needs more focus then, maybe that hasn't had enough impact. Is that what you kind of think, that piece of the whole equation maybe needs more attention?
I think so. And then again, I'm again new to this. But how do you educate someone for something they think will never happen to them? That's the trick. But I think the education of the positive impact it has in general, it is a message that would be good to get to the public.
Jenn, do you want to speak to that too?
Yeah, I mean, we've said quite often to your point, I mean, nobody ever wants to think about it, about yourself, let alone even, your children. I mean, that is put that in a box and, throw it to the bottom of the river. Don't ever think about it. And we've often talked about it, the same way as a fire safety plan at home. I don't ever want to have to contemplate, how do I get my children out of my house? Should the unimaginable happen, but that doesn't mean we don't talk about it. It doesn't mean we don't have a plan to do it. It doesn't, we don't live in sort of naive, ignorant bliss around it. Instead, we do the opposite. We talk about it, we plan for it, we make it more accessible instead of shying away from it. And it would be wonderful if we could get to that same point with talking about a willingness to talk about donor and all of the things that can come along with that from the donor perspective. I often say Mackenzy gave a gift. She gave a gift to 4 families, but I still truly believe the biggest gift she gave me was hope. She gave me something to be able to survive this life without her, which if you had told me the day before, May 1st, you're going to have to survive life without that little girl, I would have told you there's no way, 0 chance. So she gave me that gift as well. So that I don't think we talk about it in that frame, or with that reference enough.
I'm struck by, again, every time I read about Logan Boulay, I'm struck by the fact that as a young guy, he had the wherewithal to bring it up to his family, as you say, over dinner one night. Surely those opportunities are abundant. We talk about lots of things with our families over dinner, and how they also speak of the impact of solace and hope that has brought them and continues to bring them since then. But how can we make that more effective when we do our reach out for education, when we say to families, no, these are the words of the people who've been there, who have faced these things. I wonder if maybe I see Deanna Paulson is in our audience. I wonder if, Deanna, do you might have some thoughts on this aspect of education about donation?
Hi, thanks, Laurie. Thanks very much, Becky and Jenn, for sharing your story. Always is so grounding to hear the actual stories of people that have lived through the experience. So thanks very much for sharing your stories with us. I think, honestly, for Alberta, public education is an area that's been missing. As maybe a lot of people know, we've been a bit behind in having provincial structures and some of the support mechanisms in place, and we very much look forward to getting some of this out there. It is about putting messages out there and normalizing having these discussions at the dinner table. People just don't think about it, and nor do they want to. But end of life happens for us all, and preparation just serves to take some of the burden at the end of life away. I think what we hear from families is if they know the wishes, then that burden is lifted at the end of life. And because we don't tend to want to talk much about it, what we need to do is get the message out that it is important to think about what your wishes are. and to make them known. And that seems to be something that we just have not done in Alberta.
If I could perhaps build on that too, I agree wholeheartedly. I think the other thing is we tend to wait for the experience, the education to happen in that ICU room. And I think, as you've heard from Becky and I both, I mean, you know, we had very little cognitive abilities. I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for you, Becky, but very little cognitive ability to really make any meaningful decisions. And there's so much information that comes at you with the logistics, with, you know, even in how people frame things. I remember them telling me, you know, that Mackenzie's heart probably wouldn't be viable for transplant, but, you know, almost as a consolation prize, we could consider tissue donation. And that really impacted the way I thought about that. It wasn't, that might not be viable, but she could do this other really great thing. It almost felt like a failure. If she doesn't donate the organ for transplant, tissue's kind of like, you know, back up. So how do we get some of those conversations out of the ICU, educate people on the realities, the logistics, the risks, the benefits, so that we can process it logically as sane, you know, intelligent humans, as opposed to waiting for that to all be, you know, put on us in that moment of devastation.
Well, I think, you know, I think about that too. So in your experience, Jenn, you mentioned you know, that you were both holding a hand and almost as if then the thought came, because of course you had all these terrible things going on, the thought came to your husband, I think, that, well, what about organ donation? What strikes me is that it wasn't more proactively brought to you, that if you hadn't thought about it, you would not have had this amazing comfort later on. And I look to Becky as well, and I think, you know, you had already thought about it. You were very proactive in discussing it, thinking about it. And yet, what wasn't maybe put forward are the nuts and bolts and blacks and whites of, well, let's just think through the whole process just so everybody's aware of how these things actually work. And maybe that's part of the education that it would have been helpful, Becky, for you, perhaps to know, well, here are the ways these steps proceed. You still wouldn't want ever to have to put it into action, but would it have been helpful for you, do you think, that you could have maybe understood the pieces of that pathway a little more clearly before you were actually faced with them?
Yes, and also I just think if there was a hallway of heroes, or just information about, again, just about the impact of him. And I know, I imagine that a donor coordinator cannot be pushy, but I think they can be sharing words, or we do it before, you know, we do it out in the public, sharing words of solace. This is comforting. This is what they wanted to do. This is making the death have meaning. Yeah, I needed just a light. I feel like I just needed somebody to give me a different perspective than what I had. I was also alone. I mean, that's neither here nor there, but I didn't have a lot of family around helping me make this decision.
Yeah. So maybe some of those more proactive as we think about, Deanna's pointed out, we haven't been very good at this in Alberta, but I think, you know, nationally and internationally, there are pathways to follow, but maybe we need to look at this specifically as a part of the education that we do provide, and look perhaps to how it's done in some other places. Leanne, you've got some thoughts, I think. Leanne Tibbles from Calgary.
Thanks, Laurie. I think one of the things that would normalize this conversation more, and thank you so much to the speakers today, it was heart-rending to hear your stories, would be to in a broader sense, discuss end-of-life care, to discuss what people wish at that time, which I'll share my video here at the moment. At that time of life when we don't have too many options left, to talk about things that people put into their wills and personal directives and everything every day of their lives. I don't want ICU care if it's not for my benefit. That excludes you from being an organ donor. I don't want non-therapeutic ventilation. If it's not going to prolong my life, I want these things to stop. That's not going to give the time opportunity for your family to make these decisions. And these are things that people do discuss. We all know that we're not here forever. That's become particularly clear to me recently. But these are things that in a broader discussion of what is end-of-life care, what is end-of-life care in the ICU, what does it consist of? And rather than making those decisions in the exact moment when you're least able to make those decisions, is let's get the legal system set up to say, I do want ICU care, even if it's not going to save my life for the benefit of organ donation. I do want to be resuscitated in the emergency room for the benefit of organ donation. Let's get that language in there and let's have those discussions, which are easily done beforehand.
I couldn't agree more. And in the right venue too, it still boggles my mind why we're making these decisions at the DMV and not with the wise counsel of our family doctors or another medical professional. We're making that decision while getting our driver's license. So it's the right time and the right venue.
That is so right. And thank you so much, Leanne, for that contribution as we face these things in many different ways throughout our lives and those of our families. But we get down to the practicalities of it and to what people know or don't know because we've had effective education programs or we haven't. When my husband and I first did our directives, it was pretty obvious that I was in favor of organ donation, but the language was much more complicated than that, where I instead of being given a choice of being maintained on life support for the purposes of just letting time go or taking away those supports. If you very clearly put this into words, Leanne, I said, no, no. I want it to be complicated if that means that if I can be resuscitated and become an organ donor, that I do want those interventions. And the language is not there easily. We looked at it with a lawyer and it's very tricky actually to make sense of it. And where does it live when those events happen anyway? It needs to be much more forward thinking and much more out there to say this needs to be decomplicated so that it's obvious what a person's wishes were and are. Linda, you have your hand up too.
Hi, thanks, Lori. Oh my, pretty powerful. Thank you, Becky and Jenn, for sharing your stories. It speaks to so many things, and my message to Becky actually after her presentation was, oh, no words, but there's so many words that need to go into this. And what really spoke to me was the absolute essential need for normalizing, and I think Deanna mentioned that as well, as normalizing this conversation and having the public education and communication on an ongoing basis through storytelling. The impact of what the two of you shared is so powerful, and it's stories that are shared, such as you have, that help move people to make decisions and think about these really important issues. And then the comments that Leanne and Lori have made about planning for life, those two pieces need to be integrated. So I think one of the things coming from this conversation today is, how do we amass the tools, the resources, and the people, and leverage the storytelling to get this message out and put the pieces in place? Because we have not done a good job of that here, and Deanna has spoken to that. And so how can we move this conversation forward? So thank you everybody for sharing. This needs to be a watershed moment to start moving things forward. Thank you to all.
Thanks, Linda. Can I just ask Deanna one more time I don't mean to be picking on you specifically, but maybe I do, but there are new things happening in donation and in Alberta. Some of these experiences, there may be an opportunity to address in public education. I mean, do you see specific ways that we can influence this piece of it? I mean, it's complicated and there's new legislation for lots of things, but this piece of it where we bring to public awareness, to greater public awareness, the need for clarity, for nuts and bolts, for here's what the process is, so that they can think about it and talk about it at home and find ways that allow Becky to have experienced perhaps the comfort and solace that Jennifer found while going through the process or after the process.
No, I really like the idea of the storytelling. Over the years we've done little things, but nothing that was any large campaign. I think now with some funding available, we will be able to look at that. We did try and get into physician, their GP offices and that, but that was again a few years back. And I think it's maybe the timing wasn't quite right when we tried some of our things in the past, but today donation is spoken about more. Our legislation of mandatory referral, I've had lots of emails asking for in-servicing and education from the medical community, which is all good, because the more people understand and we can get the word out, the better. But we do need to get it into your annuals where there's conversations about end-of-life care. The more people talk about this, the more people become comfortable to talk or at least think about it, and then to make their wishes known. So there's social media, like there's lots of avenues that we have not experienced yet in Alberta. So I think we're all ears to hear of ideas from people. What do they want to see? What would make a difference to them? We'd be all ears just to hear the ideas.
Thanks, Deanna. Maybe just in closing our last few minutes, to have voices like Jenn and Becky, as well as Leanne, on these issues, I think capturing those messages from these very brave people in a way that certainly has transformed my nuts and bolts in the room kind of thinking, because I haven't been in that room myself personally, but you've taken my understanding to places where I can see there are gaps, there are flaws in the way we translate information and take you into a place where you can really think it through and understand it more. And maybe with continuing focus on where these stories would be the most helpful for your continued engagement in talking about these things, we can find, maybe we need to do more on social media. Maybe we need to, some provinces have done things in school systems. The opportunities to actually put the details right out there and say, have a think about this, because they are very powerful stories. And I'd like to just say, Jenn, once again, it's so compelling to listen to your descriptions of how the process unfolded and what it has meant to you over the years. Becky, I would say I hope that you find solace in making your voice heard the way you have today, because it's very impactful. It's really profound to hear from your own experience, from the nuts and bolts of it, what could have worked. And I hope that that voice, that bringing that forward in a public way, provides you some solace in actually impacting the system as we see it. And so I'd like to thank you both again for this and for I hope work coming forward, that we can find a way to move these messages forward. And Leanne, thank you very much for sharing the thoughts as well from the insights that you're experiencing at the moment. We have a couple of thoughts in the a thank you from Jen Clemes in the chat, again, to introduce in public health and in our public education system. And yes, exactly, the culture of donation, where people know these things already. They don't have to struggle to find the answers to questions they can barely get their head around because of what's going on. So wow, what an amazing session today. I think we'll stop there. We're out of time now. I'd like to thank once again everyone's input and engagement. I'd like to next week everyone again and thank Paladin again for supporting this session, and thank you all for your attendance and engagement.